So, one of the things is we always hear when we talk about microplastics that they're ubiquitous. And we find them everywhere we look, our waters, our soils, our beverages, our wildlife, and we've even found it in groundwater. And last week I was reading a couple papers about also that are reporting microplastics and nanoplastics showing up in the human lungs and the blood. So the point is that we do find them everywhere. They are ubiquitous. But the thing is, should we be concerned? And I believe that just the sheer persistence of these materials is alarming. These are designed to last forever. You can talk about, here's some examples of how long it takes for some common materials to degrade. And it could take cigarette butts and plastic bags 5 to 20 years to break down. And in the world of persistent pollutants, that's a long time. But let's talk about things now like plastic straws, disposable diapers, plastic bottles, up to 450 years to degrade. So it's just an incredible long time of persistence. And our landfills just must be swelling with these materials. So just their sheer fact of persistence, I believe, is a concern. But we need to talk about how these things affect ecosystems. Are there negative impacts, or how do they affect human health? And I believe that the jury's still out there, that nobody really knows for sure. I mean, we're starting to see studies left and right. Many of them are conflicting, but this is an area that's wide open for research. But another thing that I do know is that we add a lot of chemicals to plastics. Over 6,000 known additives are used by the plastic manufacturing industry. And here's some examples of some heavy metals I've found in some beach plastics. But we also add a lot of organic chemicals like phthalates and plasticizers, and flame retardants, and antioxidants. And we know that many of these compounds are also persistent, they're bioaccumulative, and also many are highly suspected to be endocrine disrupting. So beyond the additives, we also know that microplastics will absorb environmental pollutants. You can think of them as a little sponge that soaks up what they find surrounding them in the environment. And as they get down to smaller and smaller sizes, they have more and more surface area, what gives them a higher capacity to absorb pollutants. Microplastics. So anyways, one of the studies that we recently performed was to look at how these things can absorb environmental pollutants. So what we did is we made some microplastics. We made some polyethylene, some polypropylene, and some polyester materials. And we deployed them in Lake Muskegon up in Michigan. We put them in two locations, one in the middle of the lake and then one at the channel, which interacts with the Lake Michigan. And even at one of the sites, we deployed them at two different places within the water column. And then we would pull them out at different times and look at them for pollutants. And this was a kind of unique study because a lot of the studies prior to that would just go out and scoop up some plastic and then bring it back into the lab. But they never really knew what type of plastic it was. They didn't know how long it was in the environment. They didn't even know where it was. It could have traveled, right? So we wanted a more controlled environment, and that's why we set out to do this. So we looked at over 85 persistent organic pollutants. And these are some of the major classes that we were looking at. We looked at a lot of the legacy pollutants like PCBs, even DDT, because we knew that we were going to find them. We find them everywhere, just like plastic. But also we were able to look at perfluoroalkylated substances, thanks to Illinois-Indiana Sea Grant. And we also looked at some plasticizers and flame retardants. We looked at metals, and we also did analysis of the biofilms that grew on them. We looked at the diversity of the microbes associated with them. So I only have time to focus on a couple classes, but a lot of interesting things with all these different classes came out of this study. So for starters, we had to look at the background concentrations of these POPs in the water samples. And for simplicity, I've summed the major classes, and you can see that the polyaromatic hydrocarbons were the most concentrated of all the pollutants that we looked for. And when I say concentrated, you should be careful because, this is in parts per billion. So the highest was only 120 parts per trillion. So really a pretty clean water sample. We chose this site too because it was an area of concern. But there has been some great efforts up there on Lake Muskegon, and they're working. They're doing a good job of cleaning up the lake. But anyhow, we also found things like PCBs, some of the pesticides, chlorinated pesticides that have been banned for a long time, and even PFAS. PFAS is on the end here in the white bar, and it ran anywhere from 2 to 3 or 4 parts per trillion, which is pretty common for open water Lake Michigan surface water. So these were the background concentrations of the pollutants. Now let's talk about what we found on the plastic. And this is the site that was in the middle of the lake. It was very deep. I believe it was like 40 meters. And these top bars are after 1 month. And then the white and blue bars were after 3 months. And you can see that indeed they absorbed polyaromatic hydrocarbons from the environment, hundreds of times the background concentration in a relatively short amount of time. Now, the next site's really interesting because this was the channel. We did this over the same time. But this is interesting because you can see that in 1 month it kind of spiked, and then 3 months it came back down. So the absorption is reversible. That there's probably a lot of factors that influence how pollutants absorb to these things. And these are much shallower. One of them was only 2 meters down from the top of the water. And then I believe the channel bottom was about 12 meters. So definitely a different story, even within the same lake over the same time period. But still, they concentrated at hundreds of times the background levels. PCBs was really interesting. So it seemed to be that polyethylene really absorbed a lot of background PCBs. And you can see here in 1 month, it just spiked right up. We saw a little bit absorption on polypropylene. We didn't see any on polyester. But the interesting thing here is this massive spike in the first month. And then after 3 months, it kind of tapers back down. Not what I would expect. So we looked at the profile of PCBs, and PCBs are like the Legos of chemistry. There's 209 different flavors or conjugates of these things. And when you look at the PCB profile for the water, it's pretty typical of what we find elsewhere in the environment. It's predominantly 153, which I believe has 5 or 6 chlorines on it. But also this is pretty much what we'd expect. But when we look at the profile on the plastic, it's dominated by this dichloral biphenyl. There's only 2 chlorines on this PCB. And unfortunately, it was the only dichloral that we looked at, but it was definitely accounting for most of them. And it would be interesting to go back and look and see if the other dichlorals were there, because you can have different flavors with moving the chlorine around those benzene rings to have a different PCB altogether. But really not what I expected. I really don't have any explanation. So, but if it is interesting that when you look after 3 months, all of a sudden it's disappeared. And now the PCB conjugate profile looks a little more similar to what we'd expect in the background water. So no explanation. It was quite a surprise. We would have to go back and do more work to actually figure out, get a concrete explanation. I have some theories of what's going on, but without more data, I don't really want to throw those out there just yet. Let's talk about PFAS. Everybody's talking about PFAS, right? So we also looked for PFAS. But the story for PFAS, it does concentrate more, and it concentrates on the same order of magnitude as we saw for the other pollutants, but we didn't follow the same trends. It almost seemed like it was kind of evenly distributed on the materials, independent of what type of material it was, or independent of location. So that was really unexpected. And PFAS are chemically so much different than the other compounds that we were looking at. So we scratched our heads and we kind of wondered, maybe it's interacting with the biofilm. Maybe the PFAS is absorbing to the biofilm and not the plastic itself. And this is an example of our plastic materials on top. And you can see after 3 months, they had this slimy biofilm on it. So luckily, we had a little more time and a little bit of extra resources. And what we did is we took those plastics and we exposed them to PFAS in the laboratory, in the absence of biological materials. And you can see the rate of the amount of absorption is much less, 15 to 28%. So there's something very special about microplastics in the environment and their ability to absorb PFAS. So key findings is, yes, indeed, it was a short amount of time that we saw hundreds of times many of these pollutants concentrating the background concentrations. The degree of absorption overall, polyethylene did seem to absorb the most pollutants, and then following polypropylene, and then last polyester. And obviously, we've seen big differences even within the same water column, and also over time. They did vary spatially and temporally. And we believe, and one of the surprising things is we didn't expect there to be such an influence of other materials associated with plastics. I believe a lot of it has to do with biofilm, but we can't rule out things like absorption on metals that are co-precipitating on our plastics, or maybe natural organic matter that's associated with our plastics is also holding on to these things. But definitely the story is much more complex than just bonding to plastic itself. So when I got this data, I got all excited, and I sat down and I tried to figure out, is there a concern if a fish came along and ate it, or is there a major impact to this to wildlife? And what I determined that is an organism would really have to eat a lot of microplastics to really increase its body burden of POPs from the plastic absorbing it from the environment. So, I mean, I think it was at least on the order of a gram or two, which is very unlikely. With the data out there and what we've seen in our laboratory, that's a lot of microplastic. So, but I have to throw some caveats out there that my time scales were very short. They were 3 months. We wanted to go longer, but one of the problems was overwintering. We had problems with the lake freezing over in our deployments. And also, we know that about 50% of the plastic we find in the environment is 14 years or older. So the time scale is very, very short. And we also know that the microplastics that we used were quite large, and that was a limitation to the experimental design. But we know what we find in the environment is much, much smaller. And the plastics we use were virgin plastics. And we know the stuff that we find in the environment is severely weathered and aged, which also equates to more surface area, and it changes the chemistry and how these things interact with pollutants. So even beyond that, when I say that this isn't a concern, I'm also neglecting additives. And we know that additives are there at percent level. So the concentrations of additives to what's it's absorbing from the environment pales in comparison to what we typically find for additives. But the point is that when we talk about plastic pollution and negative impacts to ecosystems and adverse effects to humans, we need to talk more than just plastic. We need to talk about the additives, what it absorbs from the environment, and then obviously the biological materials associated with it. So anyways, I'd like to acknowledge our colleagues, those especially at the Annis Water Resources Institute, who helped us with this project, helped us get funding, and they helped us with a lot of field sampling. Obviously, my colleagues at the Illinois Sustainable Technology Center, and then my colleagues in the United Kingdom from the University of Birmingham. And obviously all of our funding sources, we thank you for your support. And if somebody is interested, here's a couple of the recent publications that came out of this study. I'm actually sitting on a treasure trove of data. We still have other results that we still have to look through and polish and get ready. I think that we might get another publication or two, especially with the organophosphate esters and some of the other flame retardants that we haven't reported yet. And having said that, I will open it up for questions.
Yeah, thank you, John. That was really interesting. We do have time for a couple questions.
I have to unmute myself. When looking at the background of chemicals, did you evaluate water surface and sediments? Were there many nonpolar compounds accumulate?
Yes, we did sediments too, and that's in the publication. And obviously, that's where we saw the highest concentration. I mean, the sediments are much higher because they're more hydrophobic, and that's where you would expect to find PAHs and such. Absolutely. We did look at those. But the deployments were pretty much in the water column, although I'm sure there's some interaction, especially with the ones closer to the bottom. So hopefully I answered your question.
Excellent. And another question related to sediments. I don't know if you can extrapolate whether or not you think PFAS absorption is impacted by biofilm on sediment too. Oh yeah, probably more likely. You think about it, PFASs are a lot like lipids, right? They're like fatty acids. So anytime you have, something, I can easily see it associating with a type of material like that, especially something that's biological like a biofilm. So. Excellent. Do we have time for a few more, Sarah?
One more at least.
Okay. Do you think the literature on PE passive sampler in terms of modeling for hydrophobic POPs could be used to estimate the rate of accumulation of the POPs on microplastics?
Absolutely. That's all that. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Okay. My study is just basically passive sampling, right? So yeah, that's definitely, and in fact, there's a couple literature reviews prior to this that used passive sampling data to estimate the how much these things are soaking up from the environment. Did I cover it, Janet or Janice? Or
I
Is there another
hope so. We can let them follow up with you afterwards. We did have one last quick question about, I know that biomagnification can happen with many of those POPs. How
Yes.
many, or how might that be influenced by absorption?
Biomagnification? Well, the biofilm part, definitely, right? In fact, when I was coming back and looking at this later with the PFAS results, I remember that PFAS is really notorious for biomagnification. So it makes sense that the PFAS is associating with the biological material instead of the plastic itself. So definitely that comes into play. But yeah, most of these compounds are pretty bioaccumulative. But I think the PFASs were the most of all the classes we looked at.